Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time without objection. Members of the full committee not on this subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. This hearing is entitled Diversity Includes Disability, Exploring Inequities in Financial Services for Persons with Disabilities, including those newly disabled due to long-term COVID. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. This subcommittee has been focused on examining diversity in all its forms and the intersection with financial and economic opportunity. I am very pleased that today's hearing will continue that work by exploring the barriers that persons with disability experience in seeking full economic inclusion, employment opportunities, entrepreneurship, affordable and accessible housing, and beyond. Disability takes many forms. For example, it can be physical or cognitive, apparent or invisible, present from birth, or acquired due to age, illness, or injury. While no person's experience is exactly the same as another's, various research report some broad trends that are worth bearing in mind as we hear from and question our expert witnesses today. Nearly 1 in 4 American adults live with a disability of some kind, and that number seems to be growing. The Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that 1.2 million more Americans identify as having a disability in 2021 compared to the previous year. As many as 7 million Americans are now dealing with long COVID and a lot of uncertainty about their future. Persons with disabilities are more likely to experience unemployment, lower wages and savings, poverty, increased cost of living, and homelessness compared to those without a disability. As just one metric, the unemployment rate for people with disabilities, 10.8%. Last year was over twice that of those without at 5.2%. Persons with disabilities are also less likely to be employed in the financial sector and, in fact, are disproportionately excluded from traditional banking consumers. And as we know, the unbanked community is more at risk of financial fraud. Thus, banking as well as housing are areas of particular concern, as the lack of affordable housing is even more acute for those who need accessible and integrated housing. For instance, only 3.5% of U.S. homes are ground floor and configured to accommodate the width of a wheelchair. I want to thank the Kelsey Group for mentioning in their mission on-ground housing model. And despite the United States Supreme Court Olmstead decision, people with disabilities are too often having no choice but to live in congregate institutional settings rather than integrated into their communities. These are some of the challenges that people with disabilities face, and it is my goal that this hearing will include a thoughtful discussion on policies that this committee and this Congress can consider to build a more inclusive economy. I return to one of the core principles that I have used to guide this subcommittee's work, that diversity is beneficial, not just for individuals, but for businesses and the economy as a whole. I have a broad range of experience and perspectives. I believe if we have a broad range of perspectives and experiences, that will lead to better decisions and better value. People with disabilities have much to offer in this regard, and I certainly look forward to the witness testimony and the questions from the committee. Thank you. I now recognize the ranking member for today's history, my friend and colleague from the great state of Ohio, Mr. Anthony Gonzalez. 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Beatty. I like the office. It's well decorated. I like all the Ohio swag in there. And thank you for holding this hearing and to all our witnesses for being here. Americans with disabilities face challenges in their daily lives that Americans without a disability would never even think to consider. Our role here in Congress is to make sure that those with a disability are treated the same under the law and provided the tools to succeed and overcome the challenges associated with their disabilities. As we will hear today from our witnesses, leaders throughout industry and every level of government understand that this is a serious challenge and have made efforts to find new solutions. Whether it is the creation of new innovative programs to reach out to Americans to equip disabled Americans with the skill sets to be successful or inclusive hiring practices, we are seeing exciting new initiatives to create more opportunities for disabled Americans. That being said, there is still a tremendous amount of work to be done. Americans with disabilities face obstacles that require the private sector and elected officials to work closely together to take on and find innovative solutions. Most notably, these challenges include trouble accessing housing that meets the needs of an individual's disabilities. Today's very tight housing market, these challenges have only been exacerbated and more costly to those with disabilities. We know that having limited or unstable access to housing can cause so many downstream effects, including transportation options, job opportunities, and even personal safety. Additionally, Americans with disabilities are more likely to experience poverty and to be unbanked or underbanked as a result of their disability. It is critical that we better align our workforce to meet the needs of individuals with disabilities and provide the proper training and pathway to successful careers. I am also glad to see the focus of this hearing include the impact of COVID-19. While the pandemic has receded in many ways, millions of Americans are still reeling from the loss of a loved one or struggling to deal with the lasting impacts of the disease. Outside of the Financial Services Committee, I've been pushing the bipartisan and bicameral Bryson Gray and Ben Price COVID-19 Cognitive Research Act, which would direct the NSF to fund research on the short and long-term mental health impacts of the disease. It's important that we find answers as to why so many Americans are suffering from physical and mental side effects directly caused by the virus. It is my hope that this legislation will help us better understand the potential lasting impacts of this disease and how to improve mental health outcomes. In today's hearing, I am interested to hear how new technology can help individuals better access financial institutions, how the private sector can more closely work with elected officials and advocacy groups to promote hiring of disabled Americans, and the shortfalls in current law that inhibit individuals with a disability. I again thank the chairwoman for convening this hearing. I look forward to today's dialogue, and I thank all of our witnesses. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the chairwoman of the full committee and thank her for joining us today, the gentlewoman from California, Chairwoman Maxine Waters.
Thank you so very much, Chair Beatty. It is unfortunate that the financial services and housing markets do not adequately serve persons with disabilities. These industries often put profit first and neglect to make accommodations even when the law requires it. Disabled people are disproportionately at risk of being homeless and living in poverty, and Black, Indigenous, or Latinx people are at even greater risk. Today, roughly 1.2 million more Americans identify as having a disability because of COVID. I have drafted legislation and encouraged the SEC to provide investors better information about which companies are accommodating the disabled community. These and other reforms are long past due. So I thank you so very much, Ms. Beatty, for holding this hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. Today, we welcome the testimony of our distinguished witnesses. We have Mix Allison Cannington, Senior Manager, Advocacy and Organizing, the Kelsey. Ms. Cynthia DeBarlo, Founder and CEO, Tigris Financial Partners. Mr. Thomas Foey, Executive Director, National Disability Institute. Ms. Vilisa Thompson, Fellow, the Century Foundation and Co-Director, Disability Economic Justice Collaborative. And we have Ms. Carolyn Sullivan, Executive Director, North Carolina Business Committee for Education, Office of the Governor. The witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer, or we will alert you that it will indicate how much time you will have left. I would ask that you be mindful of the timer or hearing me vocally share with you your time is up so that we can be respectful of both the witnesses and committee members' time. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. First, we'll start with Mix Cannington. You are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral testimony on your presentation.
Chair Beatty and Ranking Member Gonzalez, and members of the Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Allie Cannington, and I'm a white, queer, disabled Jew who lives in Oakland, California, and I've been organizing in the cross-disability rights movement for over a decade. Currently, I serve as the Senior Manager of Advocacy and Organizing at the Kelsey, where we pioneer disability-forward housing solutions that open doors to more affordable homes and opportunities for everyone. We have over 240 affordable, accessible, integrated, and inclusive homes in our pipeline, and we lead initiatives to support market and policy conditions that can make inclusive housing the norm. Today, I will provide an overview of how disabled people, the most diverse and largest minority population, are disproportionately impacted by our nation's housing crisis. Housing has failed to be affordable, meaning affordable to people of all incomes, especially those who are extremely low income. Housing has failed to be accessible, meaning housing is located, designed, and built to meet cross-disability access. Housing has failed to be fully integrated, meaning housing that does not segregate or isolate, but is mixed between people with and without disabilities. And inclusive, meaning there are supportive communities where people can access programs and supports they need to thrive in and around where they live. We do have a federal legal framework in place, including the Fair Housing Act, which prohibited discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and disability. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, requiring public entities to administer services, programs, and activities in the most integrated setting. And we have the Olmstead Supreme Court decision, which confirmed that under Title II of the ADA, disabled people have the right to community integration. Yet we have never invested in the housing infrastructure to make these rights a felt reality for the ever-growing disabled population. Today, there are more than 61 million of us, people with disabilities, living in the US. And due to COVID-19, initial estimates said that by the end of 2021, there were an additional 1.2 million more disabled people. The population has and will continue to rise. And the reality is, people with disabilities are twice as likely to live in poverty. 4.5 million people rely on SSI, and you cannot afford any housing in any US market with SSI. 55% of all housing discrimination is based on disability, the highest rates of discrimination experienced across any protected class. At minimum, 40% of people experiencing homelessness are disabled. 1 in 2 people turning to shelters are people with disabilities. And less than 12% of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities rent or own their own home. Segregated housing models still prevail, and the institutional bias is intact, and federal and state governments have never invested in the commensurate supply of service-ready integrated housing. These housing crises are disproportionately experienced by Black, Brown, Indigenous, and immigrants with disabilities. The federal government can and must invest in a housing infrastructure so that all people with disabilities, regardless of their backgrounds, identities, and levels of support needs, can live in their own homes and communities. This committee has the ability to fund, mandate, and guide the development of needed solutions that must be co-created by disabled people. For example, vouchers, especially mainstream and 811 project-based rental assistance, which ensures people with disabilities can afford housing and that disability-inclusive projects are built. Accessibility requirements can be increased and coupled with funding incentives that encourage housing to be built and operated beyond minimum requirements for cross-disability access. Stronger guidance can come from the federal government that better aligns various funding sources and meets and affirms the housing investments needed to fulfill the integration mandate of the ADA. And innovative policies and robust funding can make it more feasible, easier, and clearer for housing developers and municipalities to advance inclusive, accessible, integrated, and affordable housing. More details on both the need and the remedies are included in my written testimony, and I look forward to exploring more with this committee on what can be done to support a truly disability-forward housing future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cannington. Now, Ms. DeBartolo, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation on your testimony.
Thank you. Good day, Chairman Beatty, Ranking Member Wagner, Chairman Waters, Vice Ranking Member Gonzalez, and the distinguished congressional members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I commend the members of the subcommittee for your collective focus on disability, diversity, equality, and inclusion at U.S. financial institutions and at corporate America more broadly. Disability is the underdeveloped area of DE&I, and we have an obligation to give a voice to those voiceless individuals. I come before you as an experienced financial services professional, the founder and CEO of Tigers Financial Partners, the nation's only disabled and woman-owned financial services firm, the CEO of Rise Financial Services Firm, the only woman-owned prime broker, the chairperson of the Financial Services Coalition under the appointment of Reverend Jesse Jackson, and as an individual who is permanently disabled. I hope that my testimony will yield insight on the glaring issues of the gross inequalities facing the disabled. We must address the realities with respect to the acceleration of the intersectionality of disability and other marginalized groups, as well as the real and perceived barriers to economic sustainability and inclusion to mainstream workforce, along with the challenges faced by disabled entrepreneurs in accessing I speak from personal experience. In 2011, I founded Tigers Financial Partners after working in corporate America for more than 25 years, where I served as an attorney, a compliance director, and risk management director at some of the largest global banks. In the height of my career, I was diagnosed with head and neck cancer, and I was left severely disabled. I had my tongue reconstructed from parts of my body, using the artery, veins, and muscles from both my arms. And I learned to speak again over the course of several years. However, my articulation is much more deliberate and intentional, and have limited endurance. Cancer not only took my tongue, but it took my entire career. Fueled with my passion to still work in financial services, I went to FINRA and the SEC to start the nation's first disabled and woman-owned financial services firm. I quickly discovered that access to capital, whether debt or equity, was nearly non-existent for people with disabilities, and the barriers to entrepreneurship were more acute and difficult to overcome. Countless individuals like myself were labeled disabled entrepreneurs and fell outside the mainstream of what an entrepreneur is defined as by society. Bottom line, ableism was the common barrier I faced. I made a tactical journey, built my firm to more than 60 individuals, of which 80% of my workforce are diverse: African American, Hispanic, Asian, Indian, women, and disabled. In 2011, we made history, becoming the very first woman-owned and disabled New York Stock Exchange member and floor broker in the big board's 229-year history. So it's important to recognize that firms like Tigers compete as any formidable firm in financial services. We just happen to draw from a different and diverse pool of talent. People with disabilities are truly the missing link in the discussion regarding diversity. And diversity of thought. In order to transform the economic system, we need to meet the needs of 61 million people with disabilities and the newly disabled individuals who are suffering from long-term COVID. We have to pivot from a broken system that precludes their financial stability and seek ways to promote entrepreneurship. In doing so, disabled people should be allowed to operate in parallel with both the disability service system and the business system. Let me be clear, the gross inequalities I speak with today are not rooted in disabled individuals, but rather they're rooted in the handicapped economic resources, the compulsive disorder our society has with stereotyping ableism, or willful blindness to the lack of uniform, transparent data, and a distorted allocation of power. I thank you.
Thank you very much, not only for your testimony, but for sharing your story. And let me just say, as a cerebral brainstem stroke survivor with months of speech therapy, your articulation was amazing. So we thank you again. Mr. Foley, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation on your testimony. Mr. Foley, I will give you a 1-minute alert if that will be helpful to you. And we won't take away from your time when I interrupt you.
Thank you, ma'am. That would be great. Thank you, Chairwoman Beatty and Ranking Member Gonzalez and other distinguished members of the committee. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. My name is Thomas Foley. I'm the Executive Director of the National Disability Institute. For 17 years, we've worked exclusively on issues of financial and economic inclusion for people with disabilities. But I'm also here today as a person who is blind and has been on SSI. I'll never forget, as a freshman in college, a friend of mine telling me about this $2,000 asset limit. And I thought she was kidding. I had no idea why people didn't want me to save. I had the same goals and expectations as everyone else. I wanted a job that led to a career, a family, retirement savings, wanted to buy a house. I wanted a golden retriever. I wanted the American dream. But how was I going to do that without savings? That $2,000 asset limit has not changed since I was a freshman in college, and that was a while ago. Simply put, asset limits discourage savings, working, and hope. We support the SSI Savings Penalty Elimination Act as a first step to changing the disability economic narrative. Many other issues complicate access to financial services with people with disabilities. I was lucky. When I was a sophomore in high school, I was able to take a financial education class and it changed my life. However, that is the exception rather than the rule for most people with disabilities. Even standard financial education for people with disabilities, or standard financial education, leaves out critical disability issues that people need to know about. Things like asset limits, work incentives, ABLE accounts, digital accessibility considerations, and the $17,000 a year in extra costs related to a disability that most people with disabilities incur every single year. People with disabilities are simply not often seen as a group that needs to be financially served. We see the predictable results of this in many ways. The unbanked rate, as someone mentioned, for people with disabilities is 3 times higher than the general population, 16.2% versus 4.5%, according to FDIC data. Even higher unbanked rates are observed when we look at the intersection of race, ethnicity, and disability. Access to bank credit follows a similar pattern. People with disabilities are 1.7 times more likely to be refused credit when they ask for it. When we look at net worth, average household net worth, again, 2019 FDIC data, average household net worth is about $84,000. Households with a disabled householder are about $14,400. And household with Black and disabled householder is $1,282 in net worth. Not surprising, many people turn to self-employment There's additional flexibility and opportunity for many people. Unfortunately, little disability self-employment data is captured by any of our big surveys through the Federal Reserve System or through census. Without data, disability is invisible, and it becomes much more difficult to develop targeted programs to reach this important group of people. At the National Disability Institute, we support disability lending disclosures under Section 1071 of the Dodd-Frank Act, adding the ADA definition of disability to the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and ensuring that disability becomes a measurable activity for the Community Reinvestment Act. Banks, financial institutions, and the emerging fintech industry need to do more targeted actions to include people with disabilities in the communities they serve. There is a need to develop trust, particularly at the intersection of race, ethnicity, and disability. Be proactive in outreach.
Mr. Foley, you have about 30 seconds left.
And provide, thank you, affordable, accessible services and tools to people with disabilities. Members of the committee, I started this testimony with my American dream. Well, I got that job, bought a house, even got the golden retriever, and I put 2.5 kids through college. I am not particularly special. People do not need to change, systems do. And with your help today, we can begin to change those systems and increase economic opportunity for all people with disabilities. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for your testimony, Mr. Foley. And now, Ms. Thompson, you are recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation on your testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Beatty, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member Wagner, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Valisa Thompson, and I'm a fellow at the Century Foundation. It's vital not only to understand the economic barriers faced by disabled Americans, but to apply an intersectional lens to ensure that policies and reforms meant to address those barriers are effective at doing so for all disabled people, not just the most privileged. Thus, for my testimony, I want to bring these issues to life by discussing them through the lens of a Black disabled young adult I'll name Keisha. It is with this background that I will share 3 main points today and refer the committee to my written testimony for further details. First, who exactly is a part of this community? The community comprises of 61 million people, or 1 in 4 adults. This number is steadily climbing due to the pandemic, the mass disabling event of our time. The Native community has the highest prevalence of disability, and women make up 1 of every 4 disabled people. Disability can be a significant factor to economic insecurity and be a factor in whether a person thrives in a country where productivity and one's ability to contribute to the labor force are prioritized more than who they are as a person. This brings me to my second point, which is the economic barriers disabled people face. There are several factors that undermine the economic security of this community. With my limited time, I will touch on a few. The first, the loss of services and supports in young adulthood. Young adulthood should be an exciting time as Keisha prepares to finish high school and get her first job. However, disabled young adults understand that their concerns for independence and self-sufficiency are tied to their disability when the supports that they relied on disappears as adults. I have more of this in my written testimony, but wanted to highlight the realities for this demographic. 2, insufficient, affordable, accessible housing. For young disabled adults like Keisha looking to rent or buy for the first time, conditions of the market are incredibly discouraging. For example, just 5% of federally funded affordable housing is required to be accessible for those with mobility disabilities. 3, added cost of living with a disability, better known as crip tax. Living with a disability is costly. Disabled people are faced with paying extraordinary rates for services, tools, etc., that are needed to make their lives easier and accessible. Households with a disabled adult need 28% more income to achieve the same standard of living as non-disabled households. 4, barriers to employment. A young disabled adult like Keisha enters a workforce that has never fully considered disabled workers, people as skilled or talented workers. For instance, the wage gap when factoring race, Black disabled people working full-time were paid just 6 to 8 cents on average for every dollar paid to white non-disabled workers. So even if Keisha is able to find a full-time work, she can expect to be paid significantly less than her white non-disabled peers. And fifth and final point, when it comes to the barriers, outdated Social Security disability programs. I won't go into great detail about Social Security since this is not within the committee's jurisdiction, but there are outdated rules in our disability programs that need to be addressed. One being the access limits, 2,000 for individuals and 3,000 for couples that haven't been updated since 1989. Reforming these asset limits has the backing of policymakers and stakeholders like JP Morgan Chase. Turning to my last and final point for this testimony, which is the economic power of the disabled community if changes are made. Removing barriers to economic security for disabled people will not only reduce poverty and hardship, it will unlock the significant untapped economic power of this community. Achieving economic justice for disabled people will require applying a disability lens across the entire economic agenda. Several of the bills under review by this committee would take important steps to remove barriers to economic security and independence for disabled people like Keisha. And finally, though I use Keisha to humanize the facts I shared, I want to be perfectly clear that what happens to disabled people is not hypothetical. In fact, I myself have faced many of the disparities I highlighted. I was this young Black disabled adult trying to navigate systems that had roadblocks to impede my success. This data is not abstract to me, it is personal, as it is for millions of disabled people. The systemic and societal realities disabled people, particularly those of color, endure must not be ignored when we discuss the economic barriers that impact our ability to not just survive, but thrive. Thank you for my time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Thompson, for your testimony and for sharing Keisha's story. Our next witness will be Ms. Sullivan, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation on your testimony.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Waters, Chairman Beatty, Ranking Member Wagner, and members of the Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee. My name is Caroline Sullivan, and I'm the Executive Director of the North Carolina Business Committee for Education, the business-led education and workforce nonprofit in the Office of the Governor. And I'm honored to have been invited by Congressman McHenry from North Carolina to talk about a program that addresses the barriers to employment for individuals with autism spectrum disorder. My organization focuses on work-based learning, and we believe that these experiences are critical for students and young adults. Yet many programs such as internships and apprenticeships do not include individuals with disabilities. And this is true for those that have the education and skills needed to do the job, but have faced barriers in getting and keeping that job because they're autistic. The number of autistic 18-year-olds transitioning from high school to adulthood is expected to increase to 1 in 44 by 2028. Yet compared to other developmental disabilities, young adults with autism have the lowest participation in paid employment. There's an urgent need to develop programs for competitive employment for autistic adults. The interview process and group dynamics of jobs demand high levels of social and communication skills that individuals with autism find difficult. And many employers want to hire autistic team members, but they don't know how to support them for success. In 2018, we designed a paid internship on-the-job training program. We're working with the North Carolina Division of Vocational Rehabilitation and other partners to identify supports and up to align systems. Linking North Carolina with innovative talent, or Link It, makes the connections between employers, higher education, and government services to provide opportunities for early career autistic professionals and a talented source of workers for North Carolina employers. There are 71 individuals who have completed or are currently working in Link It internships. More than 90% of participants who have completed the program are now in full-time positions, averaging above the median starting wage in the state, many in jobs that pay substantially higher wages. And prior to participation in the program, All were either underemployed or unemployed. We're fortunate that North Carolina is a leader in supporting individuals with autism. Thanks to the UNC Teach Autism Center, which started 50 years ago, and the Autism Society of North Carolina, we have service providers with expertise in supporting individuals with autism in the workplace. They provide our job coaching, and the services are paid through Voc Rehab. The team works with the employer to identify positions and pre-screens potential interns who have the interests and skills needed for the job. The intern and employer are supported during the interview process, and the job coach works with the intern and manager during orientation and throughout the internship. They develop accommodations for the intern and help with wraparound services like transportation. At its core, Linkit is focused on system change. We work with employers to help develop online training for employers to train every team member on how to support their coworkers with autism. But true inclusion is not just getting that first job. It's also helping team members advance in their careers. Last year, one of our first Linkit interns, who now serves on the Linkit Collaborative, asked if we could develop a program to support career advancement. In April, Governor Cooper announced the Career Advancement Resources for Employees on the Spectrum initiative to provide eligible state employees with up to 5 hours of career coaching. We hope this is a model for other employers to support their neurodiverse colleagues. We've worked with 31 large and small employers across numerous sectors, including the financial services industry. Fidelity Investments and Credit Suisse have been strong partners. We currently are working to expand into state government into 5 different departments. The staggering unemployment rate for autistic adults is not just a barrier to financial stability for them, but a missed opportunity for employers to find great employees. As the mother of a child on the spectrum, I'm proud to work in a state that supports and values individuals with autism. I encourage all public and private employers to develop programs like Linkit, and we are happy to serve as a resource. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for your testimony and also for highlighting autism. I want to let you know that we have actively participated, and I was the keynote speaker for the 16th annual Tools for Transformation of Autism. So again, thank you for highlighting that. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. The first question on workforce challenges. Ms. DeBartolo, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that over 700,000 persons with disability have chosen to be, and we've heard this from many of you, entrepreneurs, largely as a result of barriers to the traditional employment. As a founder of the first and only disabled female-owned New York Stock Exchange financial services firm, can you give us one thing that this committee should be doing differently? We need you to unmute, please.
Thank you, Chairwoman Beatty. As the founder and CEO of the first and only disabled woman-owned firm, I can unequivocally state the barriers to obtaining financing for disabled entrepreneurs are massive. I was on with decades of experience in banking, a law degree, specialized in federal securities, and yet I struggled to find the path to capital. Once I was labeled a disabled entrepreneur. Imagine if it was difficult for me, given my experience in education, how could any disabled entrepreneur navigate this incredible slope? In the beginning, I could not secure a single investor. I was told I was unbankable. I discovered that access to capital, both debt and equity, were nearly non-existent if you were disabled. For people with disabilities, the barriers to entrepreneurship are acute and they're difficult to overcome, including access to benefits, startup capital, credit.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there, and I'm going to take that one thing as access to capital, only because I have 3 or 4 more questions I'm going to try to get to, but thank you. Mix Cannington, in 1999, the Supreme Court ruled that unjustified segregation of people with disabilities is illegal according to Title II of the ADA. Now, it requiring states, local and state jurisdictions to eliminate unnecessary segregation, including in institutional facilities, to ensure that they receive services in the most integrated setting possible. Do states and local governments currently track what share of their housing stock is accessible and whether such stock is integrated? This committee really believes in transparency and accountability.
Thank you so much for that question, Chairwoman. The short answer is no. And a majority no. And I do want to highlight, though, that due to a major lawsuit against the city of Los Angeles, LA has developed systems to track which housing is accessible and affordable, but there's still really inconsistencies across the board in terms of tracking accessible units as well as integrated units.
And I must say thank you, because you've just given us a reason that we can look at that at the federal level. Mr. Foley, there are various reports that financial service apps and banking websites are not accessible for people with disabilities. For example, I wasn't really familiar with this CAPTCHA and alt text, the over-reliance on the mouse to navigate the website. I miss it every time when they tell me to find a bridge. But for those who are visually impaired, how might we keep financial service providers accountable? We've done well. When you cross the street, we'll hear beeps for those who are visually impaired. Any insight you can give us in 30 seconds?
Sure. Financial services providers need to build accessibility in from the beginning, make it part of a regular review process, use people with disabilities to test the products to make sure it works for them, and make it tie it to people's compensation and an ability to move forward in the organization.
Thank you. And hopefully I can get this question in. And it's an interesting topic. Congresswoman Madeline Dean, who's not able to join us, has a bill that's called the Private Loan Disability Discharge Act. And I wanted to bring this up because student loans continue to act as an impediment to building wealth and decade-long burdens. So one of the things we're looking at for dealing with discharging private education loans or to the co-sponsors in case of a permanent disability or the borrower's death. Would you all support that? And that's a yes or no from everyone.
Yes.
And we'll start with you, Mr. Foley.
Yes.
Mr. Bartolo.
Absolutely.
Ms. Cannington.
Absolutely.
Ms. Sullivan.
I think yes.
And Ms. Thompson.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, my time is up. I will now recognize the distinguished ranking member, Congressman Gonzalez, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman Beatty, for holding today's hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for your testimonies. Mr. Bartle, I want to start with you. I've always had a sort of particular admiration for successful entrepreneurs, and your story in particular is just so powerful, and the passion with which you tell it is inspiring in so many ways. So I want to commend you and thank you for being here, but also just for having such incredible tenacity. I want to dive a little deeper on that access to capital point, because I think whenever you're talking about marginalized communities, no matter what community it is, I think this access to capital point is just enormously critical. Maybe the most important thing. I think there's some folks in this world who can snap their fingers and acquire capital at almost zero rates and on unbelievable terms, and then there's others who struggle to access even 1 cent. And so I want to hear more from you. How specifically did you overcome that? Like, what process did you use? How did you get your first dollars in the door, whether it was on the debt or equity side? And what were those specific barriers? Just dive deep if you could.
Thank you, Congressman. Truthfully, my own resilience is what got me there. Disabled people have an unbelievable amount of resilience. They don't just bounce back, they bounce back higher. I could not get the capital, so I liquidated my own assets. Literally liquidated everything I could and bet on myself. Because I was determined to build a firm that could stand as an example on Wall Street, that disabled individuals are part of the diversity and inclusion initiatives that we are undertaking, and they bring value not just within an organization, but within the community. Then as my company became more successful, it's funny to state, but the same people who told me no early on and called me an unbankable CEO to my face came knocking at the door after I became some degree of success, asking if they could invest or loan me capital. But I had to go quite a long time figuring this out on my own. And I'm going to humbly say there was one point where I almost had to sell my own engagement ring to make payroll.
Wow. Incredible. And so fair to say, the venture capital community, the traditional banking community, they wanted nothing to do with you or your company. And you had to literally sell almost every asset you had just to get off the ground.
Correct. As a startup, that's right, until they could measure some degree of success.
Yeah. And now I'm sure it felt good to see those same people come back and knock on your door and beg you to take their capital at some point. So it's just an incredible story. Thank you for sharing that. Ms. Sullivan, I want to switch to you and commend you for the incredible work that you're doing in North Carolina. Again, it's really exciting to see. When you're talking to employers, what are the biggest barriers that you face about potentially bringing on individuals with autism, and how do you equip the employers with the skills to be successful in hiring an individual with autism spectrum disorder?
Well, when we first talk to employers, we talk about Linkit as a talent acquisition strategy for them. A great number of folks that they are missing because they don't have ways to support individuals who are neurodiverse. And what Linkit really just does is aligns the systems, right? So we talk with employers to get them interested in. They identify a manager who wants to be involved in the program. We designed this as an internship program to have it's not a hiring program, right? It's a work-based learning program, but every single one of our interns gets hired. And what we do is we work with them all through the process. Many individuals with autism have a very hard time with interviews, for example, because you're not asking what you know, you're asking other things that really aren't germane to the job. Onboarding is very difficult. And as I said, the social cues in the workplace are hard. And so our Linkit interns have job coaches with them the whole time. But what we found is the support's intense in the beginning, and then it really does wane. After a while, it really, once our participants get sort of situated into their jobs, they do very, very well.
Great. Thank you. I see my time is up. Thank you again, Chairwoman Beatty. Thank you to the witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, who is also the vice chair of the subcommittee on consumer protection and financial institutions, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, thank you for your intentional and inclusive leadership. This is a very important hearing. For too long, the status quo has really failed the disability community and subjected our disabled neighbors really to a second-class standard of living. Today, we've certainly heard many compelling facts and figures which do underscore the complexities of navigating this fundamentally flawed system, particularly for our neighbors and our loved ones in the disability community. But policy ultimately is about people. It's not a document on a shelf. It is the lived reality in our communities. Policy dictates quite literally who lives, who dies, and who thrives. So I want to talk about one of my constituents from Cambridge, who we will call Mr. James. And Mr. James, say he develops long COVID. Conservative estimates put that at a community of about 8 million right now. So he develops long COVID, like millions of others, as a result of this ongoing pandemic. He experiences symptoms like chronic fatigue syndrome, cognitive dysfunction, and then he begins to struggle at his current job. Ms. Thompson, how have individuals like Mr. James with long COVID struggle to remain in the workforce, and what barriers do they face as a result of long-term symptoms? What might Mr. James be experiencing?
Thank you, Congresswoman Presley. I want to start off by saying in July 2021, the Biden administration released a guidance package that announced long COVID may be a disability under the ADA. Thus, under the ADA, it requires that employers make reasonable accommodations for disabled people. However, the standard has not been a smooth transition for those with long COVID because employers haven't or won't make certain adjustments requested, or because some individuals may not be able to continue their positions due to their illness. Some of the accommodations that can be worked is allowing people to work from home, which offers flexibility around schedules, adjusting work styles and dress codes, which allows for long COVID, which is easier for long COVID haulers, and be able to sit versus stand in case someone works in a shop. Have an office nap room, quiet area for rest, storage areas for medication, temporary shift and responsibilities. We have even seen the Office of Disability and Employment release some helpful information for employers with long COVID and their employers as to how to provide these accommodations to make the processes much smoother.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And so now let's say Mr. James can no longer work and turns to our disability safety net in order to make ends meet by applying for SSI, Supplemental Security Income. So, Ms. Thompson, yes or no, would Mr. James be receiving enough from SSI to make ends meet in a district like mine or to live above the federal poverty line? Yes or no?
No,
And would SSI allow Mr. James to have emergency savings, say more than $2,000?
no, not with the current limit.
Okay. So to be clear, Mr. James develops long COVID. His symptoms render him unable to work. He accesses SSI, but must now live below the poverty line due to asset caps that prohibit him from saving even a modest amount for emergencies, let alone to rent a safe and healthy home, because then his SSI benefits would be penalized. I agree with what Mr. Foley said earlier. People don't need to change, the systems do. And if Mr. James's disability requires him to move a wheelchair, to move to a wheelchair accessible home, Ms. Thompson, what are the challenges that Mr. James will face in trying to find an accessible home in today's housing market in, say, a Cambridge in my district?
Where as a fellow wheelchair user, I understand this issue completely. While the supply of affordable housing, that's developed for individual families eligible for the Housing Trust Voucher Program of public housing, the nation's main affordable housing assistance program, is already wholly inadequate. The situation even worse for those of us due to how little affordable housing in the U.S. is accessible to disabled people. With left to little recourse with affordability and accessibility to housing and it being out of reach, disabled people make up roughly half of people in this country who are forced to turn to homeless shelters to keep a roof over their heads.
So the system is fundamentally broken, and as you said earlier, Ms. Thompson, we need to legislate in a way that's intersectional,
Yes.
and the system's not going to change until we recognize that disability rights are human rights, that every policy is a disability policy, and it won't change until we legislate the healing and dignity that the disability community deserves. I want to request unanimous consent to submit into the record a report published today by the Center for American Progress titled "Removing Obstacles for Disabled Workers," which would strengthen the U.S. labor market. And finally, to those that are visually impaired, and top of this, I'm a Black woman with a bald head, wearing a gray top and hoop earrings. Thank you.
Without objection, and thank you so much, Congresswoman Presley. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Rose, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Tennessee, but we helped found Texas, so I'll take credit for that too. Thank you, Chairwoman Beatty, and thank you, Vice Ranking Member.
And thank you, Mr. Rose. I believe I did not say Tennessee. So that is Congressman Rose from Tennessee.
sure from your vast experience, you know that. So your story is not unlike many starting entrepreneurs when they're trying to find capital, and I'm sure you faced unique challenges, and so very inspired by your story. The challenges that you faced, both as a starting entrepreneur and with the disabilities that you were working with, make me think about the concerns I always have when we are burdening business and industry with new regulations. And so I'm interested in hearing from you, because of your decades of experience on Wall Street, are there any rules and regulations that could be, let's say, right-sized or tailored to allow firms like yours to flourish?
Thank you, Congressman. There are indeed changes that can be made and adopted in order to ensure that we not only foster disabled entrepreneurs and disabled businesses, but that we become more inclusive of a disabled workforce. And I think that really starts with disclosure of data, both in the public and private sector, some sort of mandatory reporting, because one thing we know is that what does not get measured does not get managed. And there is just a myriad of data that is cut all different ways in a non-uniform way. And it is not allowing us, either in the private or public sector, to leverage that data effectively so that we can make the change. I mean, one of the things that we've learned is that disabilities, most of them are invisible disabilities. How often I've heard somebody say, "You don't look disabled to me." Well, that's because the majority of disabilities contended with today are invisible. Well, guess what? So is the data. And that is something we need to change, and change very quickly if we are to change the trajectory of the course of the disabled entrepreneur, to allow disabled individuals to be included in the workforce and actually have prosperous, thriving careers.
Thank you. And your answer, I think, leads me to my next comment and question. Millions of adults with disabilities often find themselves in a difficult predicament, and they are entitled to seek a reasonable accommodation from their employer, but many individuals refrain from disclosing their disabled status. And so I have a question for Ms. Sullivan. Could you discuss why individuals may not disclose their particular disability when applying for jobs?
Well, many advocates in the autism community share that they're worried about being discriminated against. So there is that barrier. They're worried they'll be treated differently or not have the same opportunity as neurotypical workers. Our program is set up so that disclosure is there. We leverage voc rehab services, so the participant has to have a diagnosis of autism. We find that for our interns and the companies that we work with, this is helpful because then they know how to accommodate and set up the intern for success, and that's helpful. I'll also say that many of our participants, especially some of our early interns who now have full-time jobs, have really become advocates for the program and for neurodiversity in the workplace.
Thank you. I see that my time is about to expire, Chairwoman Beatty, so I yield back.
If the gentleman from Tennessee would like an additional 20 seconds for my interruption, I will give it to him.
That's quite all right. I'm not sure I could do much more than ask a question that couldn't be answered. So thank you, though.
You're quite welcome. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, who is also the chair of the Task Force on Financial Technology, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I really appreciate the subject matter of this hearing. I think we all struggle with this in our districts, and I do particularly so. Mr. Foley, you know, I've got a situation where I've got some major housing developments, over 1,000 units in my district, where we're starting to knock them down and rebuild them in a new and different way. And yet, it doesn't seem like there's an existing policy within our public housing authorities that prioritizes the ability of handicapped individuals to live in comfort and also have access to job training opportunities. We're trying this now, but it feels like a one-off. You know, we're trying to do that. We're bringing in some job training uh, uh, firms to come in, some nonprofits to come in and try to work with our seniors. But to be honest with you, for a very long time, I've had calls from handicapped individuals who have, you know, begged me to try to get them into first floor units so they can have some level of mobility. And you would think that it wouldn't take an act of Congress or an act of a member of Congress to try to get a public housing authority to make that small accommodation. And I know that you're a champion of the cause of handicapped individuals, and I wonder if you're seeing this gap between what should be a real priority for our housing authorities to sort of link up that job training opportunity with these individual handicapped households. Is that something that you see across the board, and is it improving at all?
Thank you, Representative. First of all, I commend you for putting this program in place. Obviously, we've heard today about the lack of access to affordable, accessible housing. So we've definitely seen this issue across the country. A lack of housing plus a lack of employment opportunities plus a lack of employment programs. You multiply three fractions, you get a smaller number. But I think what you're describing, provides an opportunity, almost a pilot to show what could be done, because we know in the end that people with disabilities want to work, can work, and once they do work, make excellent employees. And providing accessible, affordable, safe housing sort of provides that groundwork, that foundation to be able to look at employment in a whole new way.
Thank you. One of my one of my local priority projects from the last appropriations bill is 40 units of housing for people who are disabled by virtue of drug addiction. And I have found that in my district, the needs of that population are far different than someone who has a disability in terms of their mobility. They have to be on the first floor or handicap ramps. And it's been a real struggle to try to make sure that we create housing for people with drug addiction, but also make sure that the services are plugged in. We're trying to help women coming out of prison who might have custody of children. And I wonder if you're seeing any programs in other states that might be an example of that we could borrow from.
I applaud the effort to reach so many different types of people in the disability community. I think the old joke is you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. I'm not the strongest expert on some of the programs, particularly around substance abuse. So I yield my time if someone else could help out with that question.
Well, I think my time is just about expired. I do appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a very important hearing, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for trying to help the committee with its work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Gonzalez, should I move on?
Yeah, I was just about to say, I don't see Mr. Timmons, so I think feel free to move on.
And we will come back if he enters the screen. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair Beatty, for holding this really important hearing. As everyone testified, housing is foundational to many of our neighbors, but particularly for many of our neighbors living with disabilities. As many of you have heard, I represent 48217 zip code in Michigan's 13th congressional district, which is one of the most polluted zip codes in the entire country. It's sandwiched between one of the largest freeways and the only oil petroleum refinery in the state. The toxic air many of my residents breathe has directly contributed to much of the highest rates of cancer and asthma in the state. And for many of us, this is the definition of a frontline community. And over the past 3 decades, Chairwoman, low-income Americans have become increasingly concentrated in poor neighborhoods like 48217. We know that individuals with disabilities experience greater levels of poverty, as we heard today, and lower levels of wealth than those without disabilities, requiring an average of an additional $17,000 per year to obtain the same standard of living for many of us. Meanwhile, individuals with disabilities are underemployed and underpaid, as again, many have testified. That means that the devastating impacts of our housing affordability crisis are falling even heavier on those living with disabilities. For me, environmental justice is disability justice, and economic justice is disability justice. So, Carrington, when it comes to purchasing a home, many individuals with disabilities are underbanked or credit invisible. What policy recommendations, I know folks talked about capital and so forth, but really, anything that we could be doing on our end to improve the access to credit and opportunities to purchase a home and build wealth.
Thank you so much for this question, Congresswoman. So I want to start and say that rather than just look at income or credit of the individual, can a mortgage company look at an individual's story? For example, an individual may be someone who had a full-time job with a high salary and had an accident, and now they're on SSDI. Does the mortgage company understand the person's story? SSI, SSDI is a stable income source, whether the person has a settlement agreement or other sources of down payment assistance. If the mortgage company is solely focused on employment income, getting a loan will be hard for, as we've made clear today, a disproportionate amount of people with disabilities who have other sources of income, although severely low, that may be still sufficient to help contribute to a mortgage. If an individual needs home modifications, there might be a separate grant or deferred payment loan, making the loan from the mortgage company more affordable. I especially want to, lift up the importance of companies to understand the income and asset situation of many people with disabilities, but also that there is an opportunity for more people to use their housing choice vouchers for home ownership. It is rare that this happens, but HUD can incentivize public housing authorities to choose to include home ownership as an option in more areas. There are also home ownership models like limited equity co-ops that provide home ownership for low-income people, including people with disabilities. And HUD should be doing more to promote these models, and the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac should be finding ways to incentivize banks and other lenders to finance these examples.
No, I appreciate, and that is so important, because much of our housing stock in my district is, valued less than $100,000, and we require, a lot of repairs to be brought to live up. And one of the things that we did, and I know the chairwoman was a big supporter of this, is we introduced a small dollar mortgage bill, and to really try to push our federal government to play a bigger role, because much of the traditional banks they're not loaning because it's not profitable, not loaning to homes that are worth less than $100,000. So, question to you, again, many of our families are already facing many barriers to obtaining a small dollar mortgage, let alone additional financing to actually repair it and make it safe and accessible. Do you have any recommendations? It sounds like you're getting there where we need to move towards that direction. But Ms. Kennington, one of the things that I really want to look at is how do we get our government to push and allow us, because that's what they were created. FHA was created specifically for this, to push the small dollar mortgages out, and especially prioritizing those living with disabilities.
Well, let me just say thank you. That, you know, there's, as the programs I mentioned before need more investment, need more prioritization, and HUD has taken leadership on increasing home ownership, but disability equity must be embedded within those solutions. And we need disabled people at the helm of HUD and other critical agencies to help make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I yield.
Thank you. Next, I recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, who I'm also honored to share is the vice chair of this subcommittee on diversity and inclusion, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me first thank you for having this hearing. I just find it incredibly, heartening to see that you have had the foresight and just done this piece of diversity and inclusion. Because quite frankly, I think when the average person thinks of diversity and inclusion, I think a lot of our witnesses are correct. They're forgotten or they're an afterthought. So thank you so much for doing this. And thank you to all the witnesses and some of you for sharing your stories. Madam Chair, I was a legal aid lawyer, the first job I ever had after law school, and I represented the Coalition for Barrier-Free Living. This was in the 80s. This is 2022, and we're still talking about the same issues. I mean, while it's been great to listen to it, it's just, I mean, I just cannot believe that so many of the things we're talking about are some of the things that we talked about when I was in legal aid. And Madam Chair, the only case that I argued before the Fifth Circuit was an SSI asset case. Unfortunately, I lost. Obviously, the witnesses have told you that nothing has changed. So it's going to take a lot of work to make sure that we can make some significant change. But I think what's important is that we have the opportunity to help so many people. And now with COVID long haulers, I think it's particularly difficult because I know, Ms. Thompson, you were talking with answering questions from Representative Presley. I think the bigger issue is just getting on disability. I mean, I know the president acted with guidance to say that, yes, disability from COVID long haulers has to be a recognized disability. But tell me, how are we doing? Because from what I read early on, long haulers were having a hard time making their cases because disability has to be for long term. It has to be for 12 months. So how are we doing in that? And just short answer, because I've only got 5 minutes.
The short answer is that we are not doing well at all with long haulers and disabled people in general who have been seeking benefits quite some time. That gap in who is able to apply and when they're able to receive benefits is very wide due to the systemic roadblocks in applying and getting an answer for folks who are in need. And for some people, it comes too late.
Right. And Mr. Foley, about accommodations, are we finding that employers are making reasonable accommodations for the fatigue, the headaches, and all those symptoms that come with the long haulers?
I think in some cases we are, but we've also heard many, many stories about lots of employers not being particularly accommodating to short or long COVID.
Right. This weekend, this Friday when I was flying in from DC, an article caught my eye, Madam Chair, and I asked for unanimous consent to enter the record. Amazon accused of discrimination against pregnant and disabled workers in New York. And the key point was that they're allegedly forcing pregnant workers and workers with disabilities to take unpaid leave of absence rather than providing them with reasonable accommodations, according to the complaint. Is that common, or are they the Lone Ranger? Mr. Foley?
That's pretty common. I think I suspect that every witness on this test today could point to a handful of stories that we've worked with, or we've seen, or we've heard about, such levels of discrimination.
Ms. Thompson, can you add to that?
Yes, it is definitely not uncommon. And, what we're seeing when it comes to COVID long haulers is that they are experiencing the same issues as disabled folks have experienced this entire time of just the lag of everything when it comes to accommodations, getting approval, and so forth. So, what COVID long haulers are really bringing forth is the complicated issues that of disabled people getting the supports and services that they need and deserve.
Thank you. Disability Rights Texas, an organization that defends, advances, and strengthens the rights and opportunities of people with disabilities, has made it clear that housing is a right for all, including persons with disabilities, and I, of course, agree. In fact, I have a bill that I've introduced this Congress, H.R. 7123, that would require the GAO to study the barriers to housing, even in housing assistance programs such as the public housing and housing choice voucher programs. So I urge this committee to look at that, because obviously when we look at barriers, we could certainly find ways to make it easier for people with disabilities who may seek assistance from these programs. Madam Chair, I see my time is up. I may have a couple of questions I'll submit for the record in writing and within the required days. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair, and without objection, your article is entered into the record. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Auchincloss, is now recognized. He is also the Vice Chair of the full committee. I now recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Beatty, for yet another really substantive and helpful hearing. And I just want to let you know that I also fail at these captures every single time. Crosswalks, school buses, bicycles, can't do any of it. So I'm with you. Ms. Sullivan, my first question is for you. It's about hidden workers. As you stated in your testimony, the high unemployment rate amongst the autistic community is not just a barrier to financial stability for them, but a missed opportunity for employers to find a great source of talent. I strongly agree with you, and it looks like the private sector is starting to catch up to that reality. A Harvard Business School study looked at the untapped talent of hidden workers, including people with physical disabilities and neurodiversity, and they offered some recommendations for including them in the talent development pipeline. One is refreshing job descriptions. One is shifting from negative to affirmative filters in an applicant tracking system or recruiting management or marketing system. And another is adopting a customer experience mindset and how they design recruitment and onboarding processes. How can Congress partner with the private sector at a time when it feels like there's an inflection point because of how tight the labor market is, because of this academic research that's really highlighting the missed opportunities? It seems like there's an inflection point in the private sector. How can Congress partner with them to implement the recommendations that have been made?
Well, thank you for the question. And that was a great report that Harvard did. I think what's interesting is some other studies that have been done, especially about autistic workers, is when a manager works with a job coach to help manage somebody with a disability, they always end up with higher scores in managing neurotypicals, right? Because a lot of times we don't learn how to be a manager. And when you participate in programs like Link It, we're teaching the manager how to manage, which invariably makes them better managers for everybody. And the thing about the job description as well, especially people on the spectrum feel that that they need to have every single box checked on a job description. So that's why we go in and take a 3-page job description and boil it down to about 5 things. Women also have been studied, same sort of issue with why are you putting all of these things on a job description that don't really have anything to do with the job. So, that's there. From a legislative standpoint, I'm not sure, because our success has been, we are, it's a very individualized experience for our employers. I think Voc Rehab could get more funding for things like outreach. We're just able to do it because I have, just because of the way the partnership happened in North Carolina. I think that is a barrier certainly for them in reaching out to more employers.
Ms. Sullivan, I'd encourage you, if in your follow-on work, that there are areas where you see, and all of our witnesses, where you see that Congress can be a partner to the private sector in updating the recruitment, that you please liaise with my office, because we're very interested in this issue. My second question is really for anybody who wants to weigh in. And Mr. Foley, maybe I'll start with you, though. I represent a district with a lot of different public transit options, although they've been underinvested in. one in particular, actually in my hometown of Newton, Massachusetts, is a series of commuter rail stations, 3 of them, none of which are accessible for persons with disabilities, all of which have significant housing stock being built near them. And we are working very hard to partner federal, state, local to make the investments to upgrade them to be ADA compliant. Mr. Fuller, can you weigh in on the impact that non-ADA compliant transportation nodes have on the disability community's access to job, services, and opportunity?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. I've been quoting a study recently that highlights 79% of people who are visually impaired talk about transportation being their #1 barrier to employment. Obviously, if you can't get to a place of business, you're not going to be able to, get that job, even with some of us being able to work from home now. Transportation is accessible, affordable transportation is probably the, #1 ranked issue with regard to employment for many people with disabilities across the disability spectrum.
And Mr. Foley, I apologize. I'm going to have to cut you off because I'm running out of time here. But I would just, if you want to add anything else, we will take it for the record. But I would just echo and analogize to what you said about transportation to what Ms. Sullivan said about how managers who learn how to manage neuroatypical individuals become better managers. When we make transportation options accessible for everybody, regardless of ability, we make them better transportation options for all of the United States, period. And I would extend that even to how we design our cities. And it's a lesson that applies across.
I'm sorry, the gentleman's time is up.
Feel bad.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the records a letter from the group Disability In, supporting the Disability Disclosure Act of 2022. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent to enter into the records a statement from Congresswoman Jan Zykowski supporting her bill, HR 4695, the Eleanor Smith Inclusive Home Design Act. Without objection, so ordered. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for their testimony today, very enlightening. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to the email address provided to your offices. This hearing is adjourned.